think good afternoon. Maybe we'll wait for 1 or 2 more minutes. Shall we start or? I think we'll start. Welcome back for the last session of the day for this IDMC conference. I hope you enjoyed the coffee break and the 2 presentations from IDMC on the different metrics that we are collecting worldwide regarding displacement, and also the presentation from our colleagues from the IOM and PDD on setting different displacement-related metrics and indicators for measuring like disaster risk reduction and displacement. But moving from the empirical data and what already happened in terms of displacement, this last session will look on how we can predict or forecast or understand the risk of future displacement. I'm Sylvain Ponserre, I'm the Data and Risk Analysis Manager in IDMC, and I have the honor to moderate this session this afternoon with these 4 excellent speakers that join me on this panel today. Maybe just to set a little bit the scene regarding displacement risk, IDMC started a unique probabilistic modeling exercise in 2017 with our global disaster displacement risk model. And for this, we built upon the risk analysis that has been developed by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. I don't know if you are aware about this modeling approach that UNDR put, but at the time they were looking on the economic impact that disaster can bring or some country could face. And in IDMC, we use a similar approach to, instead of giving a monetary value to assets, we were looking on how the people will react at different hazard intensity. And the model that we developed was mainly focused on sudden onset hazards, such as earthquake, tsunami, cyclonic winds, and storm surge, and riverine floods also. And since 2017, IDMC partnered with different university or foundation like colleagues from CIMA through different projects. And the main goal that we put at the front of us over the last few years, it was how we can refine the risk analysis, especially the vulnerability, because it was something that we were struggling to see how we can better estimate the number of people that are at risk of becoming displaced. And this afternoon, we will explore the progress we made over the last few years regarding the future disaster displacement and for the prevention and the preparedness. And today, our first speaker will set the scene to present the different progress we made over the last few years on the vulnerability. Is Roberto Rudari from the CIMA Foundation. He's a program director. He has more than 20 years of experience in flood modeling. Roberto, the floor is yours, and please set the scene about the progress made.
Thank you, Sylvain. And yes, you served me a perfect assist, we would say, like in soccer jargon, because yes, we've been knowing, each other since, the time of UNSDR at the time, even. And lately, we started cooperating on how, we could improve, what we've been doing in 2015, 2017. And Sylvain was coming to us saying, what are the weak links? I think, really, we should do, something more, in respect of vulnerability. We need to enhance that aspect that, is, very poorly represented, in all our, super mega effort at global scale. And so we started, thinking, and all the results and ideas that, I will be showing you, today are coming from a cooperation with IDMC and within a project with the IDMC, and also with IOM and PDD in another project where IDMC is actually, supporting us, again, for some technical aspect. And I don't want to thank, IDMC and PDD, for the economic support, which is always welcome. But mainly, I would say for the intellectual one, because it's really the result, of working together towards, these ideas. And so we started, I mean, from, schematizing, I mean, the vulnerability in the simplest way. I mean, just subdividing, for example, vulnerability in, physical vulnerability that is a little bit, closer to what I'm an engineer, I mean, by background. So, I mean, I'm more comfortable, I would say, with the concept of, physical vulnerability. But then, I mean, there is also, the social vulnerability component. And we started by this, differentiation just because the IDMC model of 2017 was mainly focusing, I would say, I mean, on the physical vulnerability component. And we started, I mean, thinking about that and say, I mean, it's a very complex problem. I mean, we would like to start simple. So we started reasoning about, fast onset, hazards. So unfortunately, I mean, don't have anything, I mean, on drought. That could be, I mean, a much, let's say, more difficult, I mean, thing, I mean, to explain. So we started from floods and cyclones. Basically, and also starting, I mean, from, how can we improve, the physical vulnerability component and then move them into the social vulnerability one. So we started about thinking, I mean, we were starting from saying, who's going to be displaced? It's going to be displaced, I mean, whoever, I mean, will lose their house. If you are losing the house, you have no means, I mean, to live in a certain place, in a shelter, I mean, you have to move out. That was, the simplest, I mean, point, I mean, for the model in 2017. Then we said, I mean, well, that is not the only reason, okay? That's, I mean, there are other reasons. For example, I mean, we've been talking a lot about livelihoods. If I'm losing, my means of living, of course, I will be forced, I mean, to go and to go away, maybe not, I mean, immediately after, in the aftermath of the event, but, I mean, slightly after. Or maybe, I mean, if we are, increasing even the level of let's say, of description of the vulnerability, if I'm not accessing, for example, some specific critical facilities or critical service, I will be displaced as well. For example, health services, education services, these maybe, I mean, the medium term will create like a displacement in that respect. So we started, I mean, from like a baseline that was the one set by the IDMC in 2017, where basically we had like a sort of, threshold on, let's say, on water level. So, I mean, on the basis of a geographical distribution, say, I mean, if, the water, for example, I mean, or flood water would reach a certain level, then I would have like the possibility of having a displaced person. Okay, and that was, the basic idea, because, I mean, we have damage to the houses. First, I mean, improvements that we tried, I mean, to have, I mean, it was, well, let's not set the level of in the water, the water level, so not setting the level of the hazard, but setting the level of the real damage that, a house can suffer. So applying, I mean, simply, physical vulnerability curves, I mean, that, I mean, allow you to determine the damage ratio, I mean, on the basis of a certain, parameter like water depth, and so making a differentiation between, I mean, a concrete house or a mud house, okay, a traditional house versus a concrete house. And these, I mean, created already, like, I mean, quite a difference, I would say. Here is an experiment, like in the IGAD region, I mean, for a regional, I mean, displacement risk profile. Here on the left-hand side, I mean, you see, the simple, I would say, water level, I mean, threshold, and, instead, like, I mean, a certain, level of damage on the right-hand side. And on the right-hand side, I mean, in cyan color, you see the anomaly. So you see, I mean, in terms of, the overall number of displacement, I mean, it's not a big deal, okay? So it's within the uncertainty. But as far as the distribution is concerned, you can have, I mean, very, I mean, important, I mean, distribution differences. Going on, okay? We wanted, I mean, to go, I mean, to the livelihood part. I mean, we wanted to not to, I mean, use only the damaged houses, I mean, component, but considering, for example, livelihoods. These, I mean, makes the problem, I mean, more complex. You have to address, I mean, different types of exposure, like, for example, crop production, grazing land, livestock, industry, services, I mean, and all this part. And that's what we did as well. Setting another threshold, I mean, on those, I mean, parts. I mean, so saying, I mean, you are going to be displaced, I mean, if you're losing, your house, I mean, or if you're losing your means of living. And in this case, I mean, we have another, problem that I will leave, actually to Lauro to explain better. But the problem of double counting, people, because you might, be very unlucky and losing your house and losing, your means of livelihood. So we don't want to double count you somehow. And technically speaking, seems, trivial, but is a very, complex problem, from the modeling point of view that I will leave Lauro to explain to you. But we resolved, that part, more or less, and so having, a sort of, final result, at least for the physical vulnerability, including, the livelihood component as well. And here is the result. You see, the distribution, difference is even more, important. You see, that we have, certain areas that are, having a positive anomaly or a negative anomaly which compares, to the benchmark of the 2017 model, basically. So I think we are on the right path. But the real challenge, is the social component here, I think. And so we got back into that. How can we address, the social component on top of, the physical vulnerability? Because that depends on the economic status, as we know, education, social network, vulnerable groups. I think there is a very good understanding of that. There are, very few, models that really capture these, quantitatively, in a sense, especially in a probabilistic framework as we want to do. So what we tried to do, since it's a very, problematic issue, we tried, to unpack it and understand it, for example, in a controlled environment. So we tried, to build, we are building, an agent-based model that, is really, trying to capture the emerging behaviors of displacement in this sense, of decisions, made, upon the displacement issue, that takes into account, all these different aspects. The level of income, the gender issue, the cultural issues, the social interaction, that can influence, my decision to move, for example. And why we are using an agent-based model? Because, it has, several things, but I would say that, the most important one here is that we would like to have also a model that is able to measure, the impact of certain, policies, because it's not just, the social vulnerability on the environment or of the households that we are trying to model, but also, the intervention from, a government, for example, that can influence your decision and therefore, the final displacement. So we want to be able to capture, the two, these two aspects, in fact. What is the idea? Is actually, to go to the IBM model, try, to understand a bit better how the different groups, how the different clusters of groups are behaving, to, in the end, differentiate, in terms of vulnerability, the different threshold that we are imposing, for example, in our probabilistic model. So saying that, as we did, for the houses, so a mud house, is different from a concrete house. A person, that has a certain level of income, a certain level of relation, is different from another individual. Okay, so they will react differently. So we need, to find, the threshold for, deciding to move, in a different way. Then we can speak about the challenges of that. That's, basically the idea. But the idea is really to extract, information from this control environment and extrapolate that, in order to be able to capture these, in the more generalistic probabilistic modeling. Here is just, few slides, to show you where we are. For example, with this exercise, so we picked like a pilot area in Sudan, north of Khartoum, where we wanted to have, the majority of the information, there. So we made like a very extensive, search, not only from the environmental variables that are there, but also from the point of view of how to characterize the agents, the household agents on one side, and the political agent, that is the one that intervenes, with the policies. And doing this, the household agents, just to make you an idea, is composed by different, characteristics. So, physical characteristic of the households, but also house characteristics, to capture, the physical components, information about livelihoods, about, access to critical facilities, so all the components, for the vulnerability, but also, a quite large, component on risk perception and awareness that is, a key factor that modulates, I would say, the final decision of the households. In this sense, we really performed like a thoughtful, questionnaire. Here is just, one glimpse of that, because, for describing you all the questions that we posed, to all the people there, it would take, I don't know, maybe 3 to 2 hours or something like that. But, we asked, them, a lot of details about, of course, the occupations, the monthly income, their experience with floods, their perception, in order to capture really, all the things and then codify that in the ABM model. That was, basically the idea. And here is, one result of that, the first result of that, where you're seeing, for example, households over there, where, the movie is not really running, but, it's not a big deal. In a sense that, maybe if I'm clicking, yes, then it's starting. So where, people is deciding, for example, here to move, we have the percentage of people moving here. And also, we are trying to capture the dynamics of where they are moving and when they are coming back. Because, talking about, indicators that would describe, for example, if displacement is good or is not good, we would like, to distinguish between, a generic displacement or a preventive evacuation, because this is like, one of the measures that we are trying, to address, like an efficient early warning system, or, how long, we are taking to move, people back, and what are the policies that favor, for example, this movement back of the people. But this is really like, it's going to be like a controlled, tool really to extract, that information, and that would then help us, really to go back into the more, in the wider, probabilistic model, and see if we can extrapolate some of the information captured, by this, ABM model into the probabilistic one. That is basically the idea. I know, it's a bit more technical than the other, presentation that you've heard of, but I'm here, to respond, to some of the questions, hopefully in a simple way, simple language. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. And I think something that should be acknowledged is all the progress that we made over the last few years, just to go beyond only the physical vulnerability, because I think that should be acknowledged, that taking in account how some human being can react at different hazards is very important. And now I will also invite my second speakers to present the recent collaboration we did to assess flood risk, displacement risk, in Fiji and Vanuatu, in 2 small islands in the Pacific, where Lauro will present also different concept that has been also put in place from the research that he is leading also with Roberto. Lauro Rossi is the program director manager in CIMA, not IDMC, in CIMA. Lauro has more than 20 years of experience in disaster risk reduction, and is also a specialist on weather-related risk assessment and early warning system. Lauro, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. Today I will talk about flood displacement risk assessment in Fiji and Vanuatu, explaining in practice the methodology that was presented by Roberto just now, and try to see how this theoretical framework can be used in a real environment in Fiji and Vanuatu. So starting from I will talk about physical vulnerability, leaving the social vulnerability for another time, if you don't mind. But already taking account of physical vulnerability, you will see that there is a lot to explain and present today. So these are the 3 main triggers that we have analyzed. So people need to move when they have no longer a home available, or if they lose their job, or if essential services are no longer available in their area. So to do that, we need a modeling framework that consider the hazard part, the hazard modeling, and this is quite standard, I would say. I wouldn't say that it is easy, but it is quite standard. From global circulation model, climate model, we use this input to elaborate data on discharges with a fully distributed hydrological model, and let's say a propagation model for the inundated map. So in the end, we get a sense of what could be the inundated map in the territory. Plus, we need an impact model. The impact model is based on an exposure model that, say, with a proper characterization, tell us what is the physical vulnerability of the asset, and with the physical vulnerability of the asset, we can extrapolate information on vulnerability to displacement, and then risk computation expressed in terms of displacement. So the key part of this work is really trying to build a very detailed exposure model at building scale. We use several layers, global layers, layers that were the result from previous project, like the PICRAFI project that was financed by the World Bank and GFDRR between 2012 and 2017. But also OpenStreetMap gave us an update building footprint on the territory, and we tested it, and we say that in this case it's very, very accurate. So from the last two layers, the PICRAFI project and the OpenStreetMap, we have the characterization of the building in terms of occupancy, stories, and other parameters that are linked then to the vulnerabilities. And this is the kind of output. And then once we have this exposure, I would say in terms of offsets, we put the population in there. So residential population in residential buildings and workers into workplaces. Okay, and this is a kind of example that we have in terms of population. This is just for two sectors, but it is also repeated for agricultural sector and croplands. So then we have this problem of double counting. So of course, people can lose at the same time the job and home. And so how to let's say represent this, and we have this methodology based on maximum proximity criteria that assign worker to the residential buildings. In practice, we try to know where the worker go to sleep at night. Okay. So, and with this, we make this link between the workers and the buildings. So in case like this, we see that the black lines represent these links between the assets, and we see that the yellow-purple, not yellow, but purple circle, represent people that may lose home and job in the same event. So it must be counted just one in order to have double count. So once we have this characterization, we have the flood maps, and you can see, depending on this case, on the intensity, which is measured in water depth, we applied vulnerability curves, and we estimate for each asset the level of damage. Then we put a threshold, and we see until this threshold, we don't have displacement, but from this threshold, let's say upward, we can have displacement. So this threshold, of course, should be calibrated with historical data, and this is the threshold that Roberto was talking that can be modified, including social vulnerability parameters. Here is an example of the application of we are in a small river in Vanuatu, and we see, we produce the inundation map for different return period. This inundation map caused some damage to the assets, and some of the assets produce then the displacement. You see there are some colored building. That means that those buildings are affected, but they don't produce necessarily displacement. Okay, we repeat the experiment for future climate projection, and we consider midterm and long-term from 2020 to 2060 is the midterm period, and the 2060 till the end of the century is the long-term period. And then we consider two different scenarios, one pessimistic and one optimistic scenario, and we see what are the result. We then aggregate all the results at admin 3 level in order, I'll say, to keep some privacies on the on the building, on the damage of the building, and the, let's say, more risky situation. But still, we can have idea of what are the hotspots in those two countries. We did that in the present scenario, and long-term pessimistic scenario in this case. But also we can know the original displacement if those people that are displaced come mostly from urban environment or rural environment, and we see that, for example, in Fiji, we have around 40% that are now coming from urban environment, so most of the people are coming from a rural environment, but in the future will be the other way around. And also, we differentiate between loss of home and the contribution of loss of home and loss of jobs. And we see that there is not much variation in the future in this case, but the good point here is that if we don't consider, let's say, the loss of job, we are going to neglect a big part of the displacement. This is the last slide. It is the maximum displacement curve that tells us what are the displacement with different types of the event. The return period is a measure of rarity of the event. So if you look at the graph in terms of intensity, we see that for the same frequency, we can have from 2 to 3 times the amount of displacement. But also if we look at in terms of frequency, we can see that a very, very rare event, 1 in 250 years, can happen in the future every 5 or 25 years on average. And this is even more alarming rate. Thank you very much. I hope I stayed in given time. Thank you.
It was perfect, Lauro. Thank you so much. I think one of the progress that should be acknowledged compared to the model that we developed in 2017 is the integration of climate change scenarios. And this is, I think, something that we pilot again together to see what will be the future of displacement, looking at different scenarios, the optimistic and the pessimistic. And the result that we have seen for floods mainly is the read with at least double, at least. That I think should be very alarming for some policymakers. Now we will pass to Mani. I have the pleasure to collaborate with Mani for, I think, the last almost 2 years. She is from the University of Zürich. And she will present today the progress that she made on the impact forecast for tropical cyclone-related population displacement. And she will also present some uncertainty attached to different parameters. And one of them will be, you will see the hazard. But what is very interesting on what Mani will present and how we can predict future displacement at least almost 24 or 48 hours in advance. Mani is a doctoral student at the Weather and Climate Risk Group from the ETH. And Mani, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm here to talk about a bit on the impact forecasting. So first thing to clarify what is impact forecasting, of course, I have to raise up what is hazard warning or weather forecast. I think everyone a bit more familiar. For example, today is raining. Maybe in 2 days before, you already know today there's a high chance of raining. And for displacement, of course, we're looking for something more extreme events. And here I'm working mainly on tropical cyclone for this forecasting prototype. So let's go to the hazard warning, the very typical thing that you get. It's in the weather agency, they probably provide you information about the incoming tropical cyclone, but what information they give you is usually, for example, here it's stated which cyclone is approximately to make a landfall in wherever, some places, for example, country A, with some wind intensity. For example, here I just use 40 meters per second. Some really like metrics in measuring tropical cyclones. So that's the hazard warning that we usually see. So when we talk about the impact warning, what I would like to know is get rid of this hazard intensity, these numbers of wind speed, because maybe for most people doesn't care. Like today's raining, what you need to do is, what you want to know is just whether you need to bring an umbrella, right? So for this impact warning regarding to population displacement, I'm trying to also build the model that able to also give information of how many, for example, how many people that could be displaced by this coming tropical cyclones. So to do that, there's of course a chain of things that's being plugged into the model. So the first thing is, of course, there's a weather forecast, there's for some other agency, it's predicting the cyclones. And for me, my work is I am putting everything to do an impact forecast to give what's the number of people that could be or at risk of being displaced. And of course, ultimately for the end user, that like with this information, hopefully you can also have a better humanitarian action prior to the tropical cyclone landfall. So now I'm only focusing on how I build the impact forecast model. And to build that, I need multiple ingredients to make it happen. So the first is the tropical cyclone forecast that is actually in real time retrieving from the European Centre of Medium Range Forecast, ECMWF. And they update the tropical cyclone forecast twice a day, and I can already retrieve them in real time. And the second component is, of course, I need to know the population settlements. Of course, I need to know where people stay. I need the geographical information of where the people are in order to make the prediction happening. And the third that's been discussed is the impact function or the vulnerability. But here I use a much simpler approach. It's a bit more top-down, that I just made a statistical fit function that best represents displacement using the IDMC collected data in the past decades. And there it's just a best representation of displacement when there is a tropical cyclone. And there I also only use the wind speed as a proxy. And because I assuming the subharvest, for example, storm surge and landslide, they can be also well represented by wind speed. So it's a very simplistic method, but the good thing is, like with this simplistic method, I can also apply the model to the global, to everywhere in the world. So yeah, to combine these three things, I use Climata. It's a model actually developed mainly in my research group with also a few partner institutes. And it's a Python-based open source model that there's a QR code. If you're interested, you can also have a look. Yeah, it's just a Python-based model for now. So that gives an output. For example, like you also have, like by combining everything, you have a map of where in the location that people are more at risk, and there's more severe problem that people that could be displaced, and also give you some distribution, probability distribution of what's the most probable outcome in, let's say, for example, 2 days' time. So to better illustrate what I'm actually doing, I put a case study. So I chose the cyclone Yasa that hit Fiji back in December 2020. It was reaching a Category 5 hurricane level. So what you need to know is also with IDMC, they also reported there's roughly 23,000 people that were being displaced by these tropical cyclones. And of course, there's also many infrastructure damages and community infrastructure, electricity cut off, and so on. So now to present the outcome of this forecast, I also want to like pinpoint to the uncertainty. So just now I said like the weather forecast is not that accurate, right? There's always some uncertainty. So first thing, just look into what is the forecast. So it's actually a probabilistic forecast that gives you a range of possible outcome. And with the ECMWF, they provide you 51 simulations, which means it's just 51 possibility that the cyclone that passed through Fiji or the nearby basin. So what it means is I can now just extract like one of the possible scenario. This is the least impact scenario that you see the cyclone just passing through Fiji at the northeastern part with some impact at the northeastern coast. This is the least damaging scenario. But at the same time, there could be another scenario that just goes straight through to the very populated area that gives like really huge impact, that a lot of people that could be displaced. And by the way, this is a forecast I taken like 2 days prior to the actual event. And so with 51 simulations, then you can have like 51 different tracks that's just shown here, 50 thing. And with all the possible outcomes, that then gives you a possibility distribution of where is the most probable outcome, but also not forget like the very high impact side of it, the tail risk. So yeah, that's the hazard uncertainty. And the next, we also look into the impact function. So although I am using a very simple statistical fitting to try to best represent what's actually happening with the vulnerability of people and how they react with the tropical cyclone wind speed, but this also comes with some range of uncertainty. For example, like this is the function that I used just now, but one may say like the function might look like this, so people could be more resilient or less. So I come up with this range that actually the interquartile range that best represent the vulnerability of people according to my statistical fitting. So of course, uncertainty can come from, I think they have just also talk a bit more. It could be the resilience of the community, some age, economic status, agenda, cultural background, and so on. That's really a lot, and I'm not going to dig into it. So yeah, that's part of the uncertainty come from the impact function. And the last, of course, the population settlements, even though it's the most accurate component among the three, it's coming from the satellite data, it's coming from the census, it's the best among the three, but still we also assume there could be some uncertainty with the measurement error from government census or satellite approximation. So here I just roughly assume the total population in Fiji that can be 20% less or 20% more. And I just plug in into the model and say that's my uncertainty. So now I talk through like each uncertainty. What is interesting is, of course, like what happens if we consider all uncertainty together, all three components. And with that, I can perform a global uncertainty and sensitivity analysis. I'm not going again into the detail, but it's also available in Climata as a module that also, if you like, you have time, you can also play with it. So after considering every single uncertainty, and it gives to the plot on the right, left, the purple distribution plot. So that is the probability distribution after considering everything, and you can see actually the most probable scenario is quite close to the reported number. But of course, there's also, again, the tail risk that I think decision makers should also consider. What's the worst outcome? What's the probability out of it? So that's the graph on the left. And on the right, I'm curious, like the sensitivity of these three parameters, how much they contribute to the uncertainty. So here, if we taken the forecast 2 days in advance, the uncertainty mainly come from the forecast member, of course. And also, but at the same time, the vulnerability function, it's also contributes substantial uncertainty towards the distribution. So that's the message that I got from 2 days. And next, what's interesting is like, of course, the forecast is not just available 2 days before. It can be 3.5 days until at the time of the landfall. So I run through this whole analysis from early on as long as once the forecast is available towards the landfall time. And you see from the left that the distribution is actually converged. So that's more certain about what's the possible outcome. And what I find more interesting is actually the graph on the right, the sensitivity, because you see for the forecast member, the uncertainty, the sensitivity is actually decreasing. So you actually gain more understanding of the forecast over time. But at the same time, the uncertainty comes from more vulnerability parameter when it close to the landfall. So with this one, I get the message that there is uncertainty, and for decision making, you probably need to consider the meteorological uncertainty if you want to make a decision early on, but a bit more to consider the local vulnerability, understanding the community, how resilient they are when you want to make decision a bit closer to the landfall. So there you also need to find a balance where would be the best time, and that would be further investigated in the near future. So thank you.
Thank you, Mani. Excellent. And I think what is great with the work that Mani is leading in ETH Zürich is they are getting the number that she's predicting is also taking the number of people that needs to be taken in account if we do like early warning system, like number of people that needs to be sheltered. That compared to the work that Roberto and Lauro are doing is mainly on the people that can suffer really from being displaced for medium to a long term. That should be also acknowledged. And now I think we have seen some progress that has been made regarding the sudden onset hazard, but maybe we will pause like for few minutes now on slow onset hazard, especially on drought. And I have the pleasure to have with us today José María Tárraga from the University of Valencia. He is part of the project called DeepCube, and he's looking at how the artificial intelligence, machine learning, how they can predict localized impact of drought, especially in Somalia, using multivariate Earth observation and different data sources. I'm really looking forward to see the progress that you have made, José María, regarding innovative techniques in forecasting and understanding the risk of future displacement linked to slow onset hazards. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sylvain, and thank you, IDMC, for having me here. Today I'm going to present you some emergent data-driven initiatives that can be used to understand the risk of future displacement and, in particular, drought displacement. I come from the image and signal processing group in the University of Valencia, and we have been working for this work for 2 years already under the DeepCube project, and we have focused specifically on Somalia for several reasons, but maybe the most important one is the severe impacts that droughts have throughout the country, as it is already have been mentioned in the previous panel. To state some facts, there have been 1 million displaced since January 2021 to September this year. And we can expect that these drought conditions can exacerbate in the future due to climate change. So maybe we can rely on data-driven analysis. Of course, they present a lot of opportunities, but there are some challenges. And there are some challenges because droughts are hazards that are super hard to monitor. From the modeling standpoint, we have a lot of challenges regarding the onset of the droughts, the legacy effects, the accumulation of impacts, and as well, if we add to that the whole dimension of displacement, all the socio-ecological systems and political systems that are in place, what we have is a super complex system that is very difficult to understand in the first place. So we have all these drivers interacting when talking about drought displacement, and what we propose is that causal machine learning, which is a very exciting field of machine learning, can help us towards modeling these complex links. So our main aim here is going beyond association relationships. What we try to do is to assert the direction of which are the drivers of displacement. And on the left, we have a correlation graph, which is very convoluted and cannot give us very meaningful information about what's happening. And on the right is what we are trying to achieve, which is a causal graph. And we would like to use this for evidence-based on the ground and humanitarian support. And this is also taking into account that we need to address the multi-causality and the contextuality of displacement. Particularly in Somalia, we have different livelihood zones, we have mixed livelihoods, we have different political actors, insurgent groups, ecologies, socioeconomic levels, overall different vulnerabilities, and which translate into different drop copying mechanisms. And throughout the country, we also see different displacement magnitudes. So what we can infer is that we have different causal mechanisms in place that we need to address. However, these links are on the quantitative level mostly unknown, and what we cannot expect at all is to fit one fits-all solution, one model through that can explain drought displacement on the whole country. So this is the main slide that summarizes what we have been working on. So we focused on different districts in Somalia, and what we do is to extract time series data regarding the different dimensions that can summarize drivers of displacement, and these are related to food security, and especially market prices as proxies of food security. Also conflict, which plays a huge role in some areas of Somalia, and we use fatalities as a proxy for this. And also satellite data, we use precipitation to characterize drought impacts. and also drought displacement. And what we are trying to do once we have this data harmonized is extract knowledge from this data. So we are trying to get a causal graph that learns the interaction between the drivers of displacement, but also the time lags in which these variables are affecting each other. So here are some results in Baidoa district, which has been one of the most affected by droughts in the last decades. And let me just tell you how you would read this graph. You have the nodes that are the variables, and you have the arrows which are asserting the causal link between the variables. And then the color of the variables depict the increase of the variable or decrease of the variable towards driving displacement. And then you have a number which is the time lags in weeks in which these variables are affecting each other. So for example, we have that in Baidoa district, deficits in precipitation are causing drought displacement, but also are food prices and water prices, specifically water prices with a higher intensity in Baidoa district. And we also have fatalities causing drought displacement with different week lags. So one of our experiments was to see if this was the case in other regions, and what we can see is that we obtained that in different regions, in the same region, in Bay region, we obtain different causal graphs. So we are already finding contextuality in very near places. And for example, in the Ponserre region, what we find is we have the same drivers as in Baidoa, but we don't see water price as a relevant causal driver of displacement. And what we can do also is to extend our causal analysis in other regions with different predominant livelihoods. And although we recognize that these livelihoods can be mixed, Corriol is a predominantly pastoral district. And what we can find here is that livestock prices, as a result of stress sale, have an impact on drought displacement, a causal impact. And we don't find this conflict-related link in Corriol district such as in Somalia, such as in Baidoa or the Ponserre district. So once we have gathered these graphs and that we can use for improving early warning systems or for knowing what's happening on the ground from a data perspective, we can even use these models to improve forecasting models. Because one of the problems that machine learning has is that it can learn the wrong things for the wrong reasons, but with causal models, we are ensuring that they are learning causal features. So what we have here is a simple example. We have the red line, and in contrast with the non-causal model, it's able to predict more or less lower displacement magnitudes of lower waves of displacement, and also it predicts the correct onset of the last displacement wave till January in Baidoa. So this is like the first step that one needs to take to all models or all data analysis departs from a causal model. So the causal discovery is what we have done and is what the first step towards building these systems. But then after it comes a whole new of exciting approaches. One of it is causal effect estimation. Once you know the graph, you can perform an intervention. It can be a policy or a humanitarian one, and you can measure the causal effect of this intervention in terms of data. And lastly, maybe the most challenging is counterfactual analysis, and you would use it to devise what-if scenarios. What would have happened if this changed, or if we change this, what can we expect in the future? And this is particularly relevant in climate risk analysis. So as to conclude, we have learned, we have applied causal discovery algorithms to learn the interaction of drought displacement drivers. We have learned these complex relationships. And what we propose is that causal machine learning can bring a lot of opportunities for the displacement field to understand and plan for displacement. However, we need to improve these models. You can include as much as data as you want in these kind of approaches. So if you want to address specific systems or with higher granularity is needed, and also methodological advances and data improvements of more quality. So after all, what also it's very important is to have interdisciplinary collaboration between different actors of the field, and that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and and for inviting me here.
Thank you, José María. And I think the main takeaway regarding the interdisciplinary is exactly what we are doing also there. We will spend the day of tomorrow just together to continue to cultivate the synergies between us. This is why I will hold on my questions to you for tomorrow. The other, I think, main takeaway is the data. We need data, even if we are living in an era where there is like many data, we are still missing a lot of data to do this kind of work, especially when we are assessing the drought modeling, because we are in specific country missing like some data coming from the market price, etc., that can really help us to give us very good prediction. Now I think I will open the floor for questions. I know that we do not have, we have like 4 or 5 minutes for questions. It's not a lot, but if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Christelle.
Thanks. I don't know if I'm allowed a question, but I do have one. So if we have time, first of all, thank you so much for making these seemingly complex models and calculations accessible to most people, including me. I did have one question that I think perhaps all of you could potentially respond to, but it actually struck me when I was listening to Lauro. You had one slide where you were showing the data for Fiji at admin 3 level and the change when you integrate climate change scenarios, if I remember correctly. And I just had a question because in some of those areas, the risk seemed to decrease, or at least not increase, with you're taking into account climate change scenarios, whereas in other areas, the risk very clearly increased. So I just wondered if you could explain to non-specialists how that is even possible and what factors come into play when you calculate this.
Excellent. If there is another questions before we give the floor to Lauro. Yes.
My question is for Mani. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting, and I'm a bit curious as you pose a lot of effort in describing the uncertainty in the different components, and what's your opinion on how is the best way to put this information for the decision makers, how to present this information? Thank you.
Excellent question. Thanks, Eva. If there is no more questions, maybe, yeah, Nick from IOM.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for your excellent presentations. Just a very quick consideration from my side, but when talking about impact forecast, I'm wondering if any of your modeling is given consideration to immobile populations. So based on level of vulnerability, people who are unable to move despite climate events. Thanks very much.
This one will be also maybe for Roberto on the agents-based model. Maybe I will give the floor to Lauro first regarding Fiji, Mani, and Roberto. And if there is any other questions, please let me know.
Yeah, thank you very much, Krista, for this and noticing this, actually. Yeah, we have been analyzing a little bit the results, and it varies really from catchment to catchment, and the behavior, it could be, I mean, on the other side. So the azermat doesn't increase too much in that catchment. So even if there is maybe an increase of precipitation, but then when it's transformed with the hydrological modeling into discharge and then the inundation volumes, it doesn't change so much. On the other side, can also be in other cases where we already saturated that. So there is not too much exposure to damage, more than, let's say, more than that. So we already reached the level. So these are two things that happened. Not only in Fiji, I mean, it's quite classical. But yeah, you're okay to point it out the situation, because we have to analyze the result and see, I mean, if there is some problem with the models and stuff like that. So thank you for your questions.
Mani, if you can.
So I first answering the uncertainty questions. So right now I'm just presenting the uncertainty interplay between all the components. I find that it's very important to consider uncertainty in making decision. But however, like current stage, I also to have a concrete idea to when to make decision, how much uncertainty to tolerate, I actually also need some more engagement, talking to stakeholder for now. So that would be a better outcome, because for making a decision, probably you just need to know where's the threshold that we have to make action. You don't need to know how accurate the outcome is. You just, there's always some tolerance with some uncertainty. So that one is a bit further discussion with stakeholders from a general point of view. And from my side, I'm actually also having a master student working along with me, started just last week, and he will going to run all the past events with recorded displacement with all the past TC cyclones, doing a systematic review of how accurate the system is. And from there, we could also learn, maybe there would be a sweet spot that coming out from the data analysis. Could be, I don't know yet. Hopefully in a few months' time, I can tell you. But then in anyhow, like there should be a continuous engagement with also decision maker, what is needed, what is not for that. And I forgot the next question, sorry. What was?
The next one was mainly for Roberto. I think it was on the e-mobility, if I'm not mistaken, Nick, regarding like how you can assess the people that could be trapped during disasters.
Thank you. And if I can make like a small additional comment, I mean, on these two replies, because they are quite well connected, I mean, also to Crystal's question. Let's not forget that, I mean, sometimes, like, I mean, in a place like Fiji or Vanuatu, you know, Mani was showing, you know, the track of the storms, I mean, could, you know, very much, I mean, vary. And sometimes, I mean, in some areas, I mean, it's just, you know, the tracks are more frequently maybe just, I mean, displaced, I mean, to north. So, you know, the overall precipitation, I mean, pattern, I mean, is heavier, but just doesn't hit, I mean, specifically there. On the other hand, she showed also, I mean, how uncertain, I mean, this could be. So, I mean, we have also to take, I mean, all these, I mean, let's say, suggestions, I mean, with a critical, let's say, view. Along, I mean, your question, I mean, which is very interesting. I mean, I didn't have the time, I mean, really to go into the details of the ABM model that we are trying, I mean, to put in place, but certainly one of the things that, I mean, we would like to capture is the problem of trapped population. So, you know, people that, I mean, indeed would like, I mean, to move. So, and I mean, all the, let's say, physical threshold would tell you that they would move, but they don't have, you know, the means, I mean, to move. And that was, I mean, from the questionnaires, for example, in the area where we investigated, I mean, I would say 43% of the population was trapped population, because it's a very, I mean, thing. So, I mean, one of a bulk problem, a very big problem. We will try to capture that. I mean, also in this, let's say, I was simplified, I mean, the problem of thresholding, let's say like this. So, I mean, it would be, I mean, a threshold above a certain, I mean, limit, but also below a certain limit, for example, according to income level. And we will see, I mean, because that creates also a lot of, let's say, possibly emerging, let's say, patterns that we are not accounting for, because this is a very big, let's say, non-linear interaction between, you know, people, because that's, it's also, I mean, influencing, you know, the people stay in the house and they reconstructing the house. I mean, if they have some means, I mean, even if they are poor, depending on the typology of the house, and then suffering from a subsequent loss, I mean, a few years later. So this creates like all sort of, I mean, dynamics that we would like to explore.
Thanks, Roberto. And I think we have two more questions that are coming from online. And I think one will be maybe for José María, is how you can translate that this analysis to inform preparedness investment from donor or decision makers. And I think there is another one that maybe for you, Lauro and Roberto, is, do you have any example when risk modeling has been used to inform interventions? As I think Lauro maybe is, or Roberto. But José María on the first one.
So the first one, the first point is very useful to know what are the specific vulnerabilities each district or each area in Somalia has. So knowing what are the drivers in that area can really help towards targeting solutions. And this is mainly it. And then we can use this what we have learned to address to train better models, or to make more specific data analysis or even more better climate projections, because this is something that always all can happen, that climate projections are not based contextually on what's happening on the ground, but on a general level. So all of these can be useful for interventions or policymakers.
Thank you, José María. Roberto, Lauro?
Maybe, do you want me to?
Yeah.
Just a minute, start on that. I mean, so it's a very difficult question. I mean, these are very new results, especially, I mean, in the displacement context. I can say that, I mean, as far, the probabilistic risk assessment approach, I mean, is concerned, I mean, mainly, I mean, for DRR, we have, I mean, many examples where this was driving, certain decisions. In the case of displacement, this is one of the things that we are trying to understand. And it's also, I mean, one of the additional, I mean, let's say push, I mean, for going to the ABM, I mean, context, because that, I mean, would allow us also, I mean, to see how, different policies, I mean, might change, the behavior of people, and the attitude of people towards the, let's say, the displacement issue. So for the displacement part, I would say not yet, but it will come. I mean, it's part of our, let's say, objectives, in a sense.
Thank you. I think this is the end of this panel. Now we will have the closing remarks. But yeah, I would like to thank you all for staying with us until the end. I hope you enjoyed this panel on risk that sometimes is a difficult subject, but very interesting one. Thank you so much.